Coming up on UGTV. A special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
Good afternoon. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Thank everyone for being here tonight. Ask the clerk to announce the meeting and call roll.
A special session has been held on Wednesday, March 7th, 2018 at 5 o'clock p.m. in the 5th floor conference room for a budget retreat. Roll call. Townsend.
Here.
McKiernan.
Here.
Mugia. Johnson.
Here.
Kane. Markley.
Here.
Walters.
Here.
Philbrook.
Here.
Bynum.
Here.
Burrows. Alvey.
Here. I'll turn it over to Administrator Bach. Please start us off.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Well, it's that time of year again. Time to start getting excited, get into where we are on the finances.
You mean it's soccer time?
I want to hear our mayor this time next year.
Yeah, he'll be really excitement in his voice when we come up.
Instead of just being facetious, yeah.
Tonight we've put together a program fairly similar to what we've done in the last couple of years, where we've developed our interactive model for you to work with. Spent a little bit of time putting it together, I think. So what we're after tonight as we go through this is really to talk about kind of we'll do the setup of where we are on the budget, kind of walk back through some of the things we have laid out for goals, look at where we are from financial forecast modeling, tell you what's within the budget and how we've developed it and why we're at where we are today. And then we'll show you the model and I'll go through the initiatives that we've laid out. There'll be room for you to kind of work through some of the initiatives. And this is higher level. You know, we're not in this saying, well, we need to buy this for $50,000 or something. Quite frankly, we're trying to stay at the $500 to the $1 million level. So if you're looking at it from a perspective of where we want to reduce the mill rate, or we go after debt, or here's a big initiative we want to include like we did with the SOAR, or fund that at different levels like we threw in demolition last year and things like that. So it's kind of hitting some of those big level projects that we want to target, or just directions that you want me to go after as we start building the budget this year. So I've laid out an agenda that kind of runs through this minute play-by-play as we work through this. And I'm going to take it from this point. This is broke out. It shows the different areas we have, the goal review, the financial forecast, and such that I've just kind of walked through, and then we'll get down and talk about our calendar at the end of the day. But we're going to kind of move through this. First hour will be more of staff presenting to kind of get everybody up to where we are, and if there's questions about that, if we can get through it in less than an hour, then we'll just move on to dinner that much quicker, and then move right into the policy discussion regarding the initiatives. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joe Connor, and he's going to start walking through the well, I'll ask, are there any questions of the commission before we move through this? Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Joe and let him walk through the
Thank you, Doug. So the first thing that we've been reminding ourselves of as we prepare budgets and do programs and just kind of move the organization forward is the strategic planning process we did in November of 2016. And so you can see we've got the color wheel with our 6 major areas in it. This is the policy document that we're asking all the departments to justify how they're going, what are they doing in their departments every day to meet these 6 criteria. And so we're getting into our strategic planning. That's how we're going about it. I just, as a reminder for you all, these are the concepts that we're going by, that you all have approved. And so as we get into the again, as Doug said, the high level planning, just we're trying to keep these things in mind. And then again, as we're developing and implementing our approaches to move forward, these are always kind of in the front of our thought process. And just no need to read these necessarily, but we set a really good vision, mission, and our values as we're developing our programs and setting our budgets and trying to meet the needs of our citizens. And so anyway, just wanted to show you these before we break into, as we go through the other information, and we break into the small groups. Part of the facilitator's job, which will be me and Gordon and Emmerich, is to try to keep you focused and reminding you of this is the overall direction we want to try to get to. So is there any questions with any of that? I know this is maybe a little bit new to you, Mayor. You weren't part of that process in November, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Okay, and now it's time for Kathleen to start to get into the financial forecast.
Thank you, Joe. So thank you very much for attending tonight. We're looking forward to the conversation and discussion of the policy direction we hope to take the unified government into the next future years. So we're going to start off by doing a brief review of the 2017 budget, and that just ended at the end of December. And then we're going to take a look at the future 5-year forecast that begins in 19 through 2023. So we're taking a look, and we're reviewing 2017 just to give you a feel for how much available resources we have within the consolidated general fund. So remember, the general fund is 3 funds. It's the city, the county, and the Consolidated Parks Fund. This is all combined together. What I've provided here is 4 years of a little bit, history and information to provide you some context. We have the revenues on the top, less the expenditures in the middle, and then how much available fund balance is provided here. Now, I want to point out this is on a modified accrual basis, which are the numbers we report in our CAFR. It's not on the Kansas cash basis. So tonight we're going to talk modified accrual basis. When we start doing the budget process and those workshops that started in June, those will all be on a cash basis, just so you know. As you can see here in 2015, we ended the year with $31.5 million in our fund balance, and I'm going to remind you that there was a net margin of $15 million. That's because mainly because of this $9.8 million one-time resource, because we sold the Cerner property. All right, so that money carried forward into 16. 16, we ended up pretty much at the same point as we did in 15, because our net margin was only about $100,000. You see that? So that resulted in the fund balance being 16% of expenditures, right? Currently, our policy is, our official policy is 10% of expenditures. We clearly reached that already, and we're going to have a conversation about that. So now we started 2017, and we received $210 million in revenue, and we only expended $203 million, with a net margin of $7.2 million. And that $7.2 million is going into our fund balance and growing it from 31.6 to 38.8. It also improves our reserve from 16% to 19%. All right. So, and then lastly, I've got here what our 2018 adopted budget is. So as you know, and by the way, the 2018 adopted budget includes some revisions to the 2018 revenue estimates based on, additional information I've been reviewing over the past few months. So as a result, I'm expecting to collect $213 million in revenue, less expenditures of $209 or $210 million, for a net margin of $3 million coming into the fund. And so if we were to collect all that money and spend it all, then our fund balance would be roughly $42 million, which is 20% of expenditures, okay? Now, I'm gonna talk a little bit about why it is that our 2017 revenues and expenditures performed as they did. To give you a little background information. So this slide is the 2017 revenues, and one of the biggest revenues is sales and use tax. So we assumed that the sales and use would increase by 2.5% over the 2016 actuals. Plus, we were going to collect that $9.4 million in new star bond revenue. What actually happened was that our sales and use tax increased 5.5% over the 2016 actuals. And that is partially due because we also, not only is it, there were improved retail activity, but there was also this one-time collection of $850,000 in use tax paid by the Amazon company as a result of their acquisition of all the robotics they acquired in order to bring their factory on, or the distribution center online. So that's a one-time additional revenue I hadn't planned on. Good news. In addition, we collected, instead of $9.4 million, we collected for star bond revenue, we got $10.3 million. And that's because we paid off the star bonds 1 month before the end of the 2016 fiscal year. So we got 1/12 of the star bond base, but we didn't get that until April of the subsequent year. So that's why it got all lumped into 17. So, some good news on, obviously the performance of sales tax is better than I anticipated, and we have incorporated that new information into our estimate for 18 and 19 and the forecast. Property tax, I had AV growing by 2.5% as was certified by the clerk, and I also estimate we had a 2 mil reduction built in, and I also estimated that our delinquency rate on our collections was only going to be 5%. Usually in the past it's been between 6 and 7%, so I was hoping that it was going to come down. Turns out I was wrong. It's still at 6%, so 6.8%. So that was money that we didn't collect that I had anticipated. So there's a little bit of an offset between these two, right? Where this was coming in higher and this came in a little lower. On the BPU pilot, I estimated a 2.4% increase in the franchise tax payments from the Board of Public Utilities for both electric and 1.1% increase over 2016 for water. And this assumption included the fact that they were increasing their rates. Instead, we're still analyzing it, but instead the payments coming in from the BPU represented a 7.9% increase over 16, which was greater than the 2.4 that I anticipated. So we're still studying that. It may have been some utilization issues. It also might have been a timing issue. Perhaps maybe December's payment last year didn't come until February or March. So, there's a little bit of timing issue maybe involved there too. On motor vehicle, more good news here. I anticipated a 3.6% decrease over the 16 actuals, and that was due to the fact that revenue, it jumps around a lot, but it looked like it was trending downward for me. It's also, the estimates are also provided by the state, so I went with the state's estimate, and they were kind of wrong. It came in 21% higher than the 2016. And 21% seems like a lot, but we're talking the difference between 6.6 million and 7.9 million. So, and I think that was partly due to, you know, there's the economy's pretty hot. There's greater vehicle sales amongst our residents. They ended up having to pay more taxes on their higher valued vehicles. But also we had noted that there's increased enforcement on for the UG thanks to personnel in the sheriff's department. So I think a combination of all those things. One other couple of other noteworthy revenues, they're not real big, but they draw some attention, is mortgage registration. Now we're estimating, because of some legislation that occurred several years ago, we are anticipating that we're going to have a loss on that revenue source. The loss is expected to be about $500,000 between last 2015 and 18. And by the way, this revenue source right now is estimated at, or in 17 is estimated at $750,000. But it actually came in at $887,000, which is a lower drop than I anticipated. So maybe the loss is not as great or trending as great as I had anticipated. On the casino revenue, they pretty much are flat. You know, we've got a 3% gross revenues, which represents 3.37 million. That's a 30.6% increase over the actuals. And that was achieved during the budget, and the same goes for the additional 1% contribution. And then also that hotel penalty that they pay to us. Okay. On the expenditure side, any questions on the revenues? On the expenditure side, did I do it? Oh, there you go. Personnel, we anticipated a 2.5% increase over 18 actuals, and that includes all the built-in increases in our labor contracts, as well as the benefit structures laid out by our contracts. And instead, the costs came in about 3% over actuals, and partially due to overtime and some additional health insurance contributions we made. On the services side, we anticipated a 6.5% increase over actuals due to inflationary costs, but also various new initiatives. What actually happened was a 4.2% decrease over the 16 actuals, and that was due to over 1.5 million in savings in the lower contract inmate beds, lower legal defense fees, and lower insurance premium costs. So there was just a little bit of contractual services money that had been appropriated that ended up not getting spent. On the commodity side, we anticipated 13% increase over 16 due to higher anticipated utilities and some higher fuel costs, but that increase was only 8% after all. And we're not talking about, you know, the variance is not a lot of money here. Capital outlay, we budgeted $7.5 million for cash-funded capital outlay projects, which also includes equipment. It also includes lease-financed payments on vehicles, and the performances that our departments, for the most part, spent all of that. They spent $6.6 million. And the difference between 7.5 and 6.6 is largely due to the timing of the lease financing payments which were postponed to the subsequent year due to the delays in the acquisition of the equipment. Grants pretty much we anticipated increases in grants, but they didn't quite come in as high as we had expected. And then transfers were pretty standard with what were budgeted. So overall, any questions on that? That's why we ended up the year in 17 with about $7 million more going towards our fund balance. Okay. Questions?
Real quick, I just want to, our debt service, our debt payments, principal and interest, did that pretty much match what we had expected it to in 17?
Oh yeah. So it's hard not to go wrong there because they're all set in right. Bond documents.
We'll circle back to that later, though, and I'll just want to know the value of that, but that's good.
Yes, and our debt payments are not reflected in these numbers. They're in a separate bond and interest funds.
Right.
Anything else? All right. So now I'm going to skip over to the next future 5-6 years. So, so based on the experience we saw in 17, and then I've incorporated some of that experience into revising our 2018 revenue estimates, leaving 2018 expenditures alone as adopted. You see that we are expecting to end our fund, to end our in 2018 budget with, let's see, I think it's around $4.9 million, right? That's our fund balance, right? So fund balance, you remember, is also, if you look over on the balance sheet, it's all assets minus all liabilities. That's what fund balance is. So it includes receivables and payables and all kinds of things. So now, when we do our long-term financial planning, we like to use that modified accrual approach. And so you can see, we're looking here on the income statement. You got the revenues, which is that blue line, and the red line are the expenditures. And of course, what we all want to see is that that expenditure line is below the blue line. And it looks like, and it turned out that way. And honestly, I didn't have to play with it at all. It worked out that way just fine. I've worked for a lot of communities when, boy, that red line is way above the blue line. So just so you know. Now, so now, of course, this is a baseline. So we don't necessarily have any kind of policy decisions built in. It's the existing status quo. So, for example, we haven't built in an additional mill reduction in 19. We haven't augmented our capital outlay or capital, investment. We've kept it all pretty much the same. Only thing we've built in is anticipated increases in sales tax and property tax, given the current information we have in place, as well as the anticipated inflationary increases, and then also what our labor contracts have. Now, but on the salary side, we did include 2%, well, I'll talk about the assumptions in a minute, but we did include increases in personnel for those years, okay? Now, on the fund balance side, so given that baseline, this is how our fund balance is growing. So right now, at the end of 18, we're anticipating a fund balance reserve of 19.7% of total expenditures. If we just all went home and did not touch the budget at all, adopted it just as it is, and then by the end of 2023, we would have a reserve of 25%, so in 5 years.
So, Kathleen, if you would describe, are you going to go in later into the advantages of moving up to 25%?
I certainly can, yes.
Okay, because I think it's important, at least for those who are watching, to understand that when people look at this, they're going to say, well, we have this increasing fund balance, which could be used for either more services or reduced taxes, but you've already built in assumptions for reducing the mill levy and cost of living increases, et cetera, for personnel and other expenses. But that if we just allowed this to trend as it's been trending over the past several years, we would still be able to achieve an improvement in our revenue balance, our balance, reserve balance, to 25%, which has advantages long-term for the fiscal sustainability of the city.
Yes, yes. So I, well,
Just want to clarify, Mayor, you said she has not built in additional mill rate reductions.
I thought you said 2019.
No mill reduction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep, it's all the same.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you said a 1%.
So whatever the mills were.
Modest COLA in this at the 2%.
Okay.
That's
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
So anyway, but I can briefly explain the benefits of the 25%. And we are going to touch on it later on. But so right now, the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, recommends that organizations of our size have at least 2 months of operating reserve. And 2 months, if you divide 2 into 20 or into 12, you get it roughly about 17%. And so, and the reason is because you want to have enough cash flow to be able to, to pay your bills. Sometimes the revenue doesn't always come in evenly throughout the year. So there's that seasonality you want to care for. But also there's a lot of unexpected things that can happen with an organization our size, and you want to be able to have enough cash to meet all those needs. So they recommend 2 months, but then they also provide cities with this risk assessment tool to determine whether an additional month is probably a good idea. And so I went through that risk assessment tool myself, and I kind of factored in the fact that, we could have a tornado go right through our retail activity, but other things that are probably more likely is, for example, there's probably some legislation coming down the pipe that may dramatically affect the value of the appraised value of our property, and that may impact our revenue generation dramatically. Then there's also other tax measures which are that we have on our list that are up for renewal. If those didn't renew, then we'd have to come up with some other contingencies. So, just a lot of reasons for getting an extra month. So I would recommend definitely that we at a minimum stay at the 2 months expenditure, 2 months of expenditures, which is that 17%, and we've already achieved that. So that's great. The credit rating agencies are very happy with that. Now I'm telling you, all our neighbors, I looked it over, and most of our neighbors are at the 25 to 30% range. There are a few that are lower than that, or where we are, and of course the credit rating agencies are wanting us to bump it up to be the same as our neighbors, or the medium.
So could you say, so if we were to go to the 25% level with the third month, does that change the borrowing cost for the unified government?
It does. So if we were to get up to 25, and if both Moody's and S&P still has us at AA. If we got up to 25, it's pretty likely, or there's a good chance that Moody's would bring us up to that same level as well. We could experience a 50 basis point reduction in our general obligation interest rate. So, and that 50 basis point reduction equates to roughly an annual savings of around $375,000 per year on every bond issue, $20 million bond issue we do. So 375, so if you do a $20 million bond issue 1 year, then you're going to save $375,000 in interest in that year, and then for the next 20 years. If you do a second bond issue, for $20 million in the next year, then you're going to save another $375,000. So you kind of understand. And over that period, if you did, it really grows. The savings really grows. And of course, you can then take that savings and pay cash for other projects. So, and then in addition, I'm estimating if we added another month to our reserve, then you could also improve our investment earnings on our portfolio. So, which is about another $400,000 a year. So, all right.
Is this the question and answer time now? Or?
No. So.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Oh, but you can answer questions. Yeah.
No, I'll wait.
Yeah. I didn't mean to talk so much about the reserves. So let me move forward to the next slide. So here are the assumptions for the forecast. And the reason we want you to understand the forecast assumptions is so that when later on we're going to break you out into small groups and give you an exercise that would plan out the available resources which are that fall to the bottom after assuming that we're staying at the 17% general fund reserve. all right? And so we're gonna get to that point later, but first let me show you how the assumptions that I have put together in order to determine the baseline of the forecast, all right? So first off, for sales and use tax, I'm estimating, which is a substantial revenue source, I'm estimating, this is only the revenue page here, I'm estimating that they're gonna grow 5% in, actually in 18 and 19, and that's based on a 5-year average growth rate. Oh, well, I think I meant to say that, so there's a little typo. It's 5% in 20, this should be 2020. So it's 5% in 2018 and 2019, and then between 2020 and 23, I have it at the 5-year average growth rate of 3.3%. All right? The $12 million, just a reminder, the $12 million in new sales tax revenue as a result of the STAR bonds, $9 million of it is going to the general fund. The other $3 million is going to EMS and dedicated sales tax. Now, this portion that's going to the general fund, it has to remain flat because that's what's required in the bond documents. But the portion that's going to EMS and dedicated sales tax are allowed to grow. But tonight we're really only talking about the general fund. So, but I just wanted to make that clear. Property tax revenue is projected to be 5.5% in 2019, and then a 2.5% increase thereafter based on an average growth rate of 2.5 between the average growth rate during that prior period of 2013 through 18. The delinquency rate, I have it at 6.5% for 18 and then 6% for 19 through 2023. Hopefully we can get that, we can achieve that through better collections. The franchise taxes, I have the BPU electric pilot increasing by 5% in 18, which reflects the rate increase that they adopted, and then dropping down to a 1.6% thereafter to just reflect, average utilization or, the kilowatt hours and, how much that is, and then cost of living. Other franchise taxes have all been adjusted accordingly based on their respective commodity or service and based on economic trends. And they average around 1.5% annually. All charges for services, which roughly is about $12 or $13 million, have been increased by about 1.9, which is the average inflation rate. On the expenditure side, we have personnel costs for 18 at the budgeted level that you approved. And then 19 and beyond, we're basing them on the following projections by category. Salary increases are 3% for law enforcement personnel, 2% for all other. And annual increases begin in 2019. So we have built into the model 3% in 19 and 20, 21, 22, right, every year. So that's already built in as a cost. We've also built in an annual increase of 2.5% for retirement benefits just to meet those obligations that we have with CAPERS and KPNF. We've added an additional $1 million per year into the retirement line in order to accommodate expected penalty payments to CAPERS as a result of what we anticipate to be the silver tsunami. I've talked a little bit about this last year, but what happens is many of our public safety employees, when they're ready to retire, they have the ability to cash in various accrued leave, vacation, and sick leaves, and that payout is added to their income for that year, which makes the income higher than CAPERS they had been paying into CAPERS, and as a result, CAPERS then turns around and sends the UGA bill to make up that difference on an actuarial basis. So that's what those penalty payments are. And we already have built into the forecast, the 18 year has about $1.5 million of those sorts of payments. We've added another $1 million, so just in case. Health and workers' comp increases by 5.7% in 19, and then annually by 2.5%, consistent with the salary increases. We've assumed that healthcare claims will remain contained between the $25 to $27 million per year and total, and then an extra half million dollars annually between 18, 19, and 20 have been included in workers' comp in order to repair a negative liability position we have in that fund. In order to and we need to do that in order to keep our permit with the state. So contractual services and commodities at the prior year actual levels, plus a little bit of inflationary adjustments. For example, you know, we've entered into contracts that require us to give cost of living adjustments. For example, our transit authority contract or the trash collection contract. We've left contract inmate housing flat. We expect that if there's a $2 million savings, if there's any savings there, then we're going to divert those savings or reclassify it towards the repayment of the juvenile center debt service, which we issued just a few weeks ago. And commodities have just been increased based on economic trends. Lastly, capital outlay for 19, we've set it at $6 million, which is the current level. And that includes $2 million in lease obligations that we already have. So the difference is, you know, $4 million in various one-time capital projects that are programmed into the CMIP program. So overall, all of these adjustments result in this final kind of summary here by category, and this is the baseline. This is the baseline. So this is a summary of lots of financial information. There's over 40,000 accounts, and they've all been condensed into this, 15 different lines. So now, of course, I know all of you are very high level, so we're going to get right to the bottom line, which is how much is the difference between the revenues minus expenditures. So as you can see, again, I will take you back to the 17 number, which is $7.1 million. That's the positive net margin. And then as you can see in 18, I'm anticipating it to be 3.1 million. In 19, 3.6 million, and so on, right? So these are annual additions to the fund balance. So this number is cumulative, this one down below here, right? That's a cumulative number. All these numbers up here are not cumulative, okay, right? All right, so, and as I mentioned before, if we just didn't do anything and kept going, then we'd end up with a 25% fund balance at the end, right? But right now, we're sitting at 19% of our total expenditures, which is greatly better than what we've been in the past, for sure. All right. Yes. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Kathleen, do you remember looking to see about how much, where we were in 2013, 2014, as far as percentage-wise? Do you remember? Or have you looked at that?
Well, I do. I have it at the end here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No, these are just some back pocket slides that in case we need to refer to them. Here's the history of our fund balance since we initially consolidated,
Oh, wow, okay.
So, starting in 1998. So here's the percentage. And we started out in 36, and then it kind of jumped. There was a recession then, remember? Because it went back up, and then it came down, and this is where we are now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're ready to jump into the next part. You have questions for Kathleen?
No, I'm good. That's good. You're next.
Is this the next part?
Going toward the initiatives, yes.
Okay, because there's a couple of very fundamental things that have been left out of or not included in her assumptions.
Okay.
You know, the red and the blue line, they match each other, revenue and expenses, really well, but there's a couple of assumptions that have been made that kind of run counter to what we've been discussing for a while. So I want to make sure, looks like we're going to talk about those now, though.
Well, we can talk.
You can ask questions.
Question.
Well, I mean, you've got your revenues and expenses, and they parallel each other perfectly, but they don't include any sort of mill rate reduction in any year, which we've always said we're going to reduce that mill rate, and they don't include any sort of pilot reduction. And we've always said we want to reduce the pilot as well. So it's a great place for jumping off, but there is no margin for error. So if pilot revenues don't exceed historic, or don't meet historical, we're going to have to cut expenses. If we want to reduce the mill rate, we're going to have to cut expenses somehow, or assume a growth greater than you've projected. And I think, frankly, your projections are really good. They're pretty conservative projections on both income and expense, but it doesn't anticipate any sort of pilot or mill rate reduction.
So
That's right, and that's exactly where we wanted to go tonight,
Okay.
because we feel like those are policy directives that we wanted to build ourselves into normal. And I think one thing that is different is previous years we'd walked in here and even had flat line on salary adjustments. We at least have a modest COLA for our employees here. If we want to do some kind of salary increase, that's different, but we didn't want to go after pilots. So I think that's a great transition. So I'm going to jump in here now. And I know I told you all we were going to go to dinner if we got done early, but I just did that so you wouldn't ask me questions. Sorry, we're
Really smart.
sorry we're not quite ready for it, so got to wait another 15 minutes and then we'll transition to that. So I'm going to grab it from this point. And I think we have as Kathleen and her team have developed a really good exercise that I think grows on a little bit from where we've done, that those of you have been through it. But I wanted to walk through this, and Commissioner McKernan, this is exactly what you're talking about. So we have our initiatives that are up here. So we have property tax reduction. This is what we did in 2018. So let's just hit some of these big ones. Some of them are ongoing, some are new. So we did a property tax reduction that account to $2.1 million. 2 years in a row equals over $4.2 million, but last year's was about that much taken out of the budget. That goes on forever. Street and neighborhood improvements, we had about $26.5 million built in our budget to go toward that kind of initiative this year. SOAR, we're spending $2.6 million. And those go through various things. Big one we did was adding into the demolition budget for this year. Public safety and operating equipment, $34.7 million. Big one we had there that hits this year budget, but it falls over into the debt side of the equation, was for the juvenile center. And remember, that was about a $23 million one. UG Communication and Services, we spent $335,000. Investment or buildings, that's 6.6, and that just went from cooling tower complex, roof replacement, stuff like that, HVAC. And then we funded 2% salary increases for UG employees. Actually, the 3% that we built in, we moved it up to for our law enforcement personnel. Those are the big higher level initiatives that are in this year's budget that are working. There's a lot of granular type things underneath each one to get into. Sure.
So when we say the projections keep everything the same, are these all considered one-time expenses in the projections, or are some of them?
It's a mix.
It's a mix, I think. Some of these things like the capital, yeah, that's in there, but it's not. the additional money in some areas, we've got our capital still based at debt line of $15 million. So that's below. We went above that last year. We anticipated some things to where we would cover the cost of that, but we went back to the 15 going forward.
What about the
So when I built the long-term financial forecast, I took out one-time items. So one-time items are not carried forward to the future. And the only one-time or kind of discretionary, like he's mentioned, is the cash-funded resources we're dedicating for capital. But we kept that at $6 million.
So SOAR, I'm sorry, I'll do that. The 2.6 million, the demolition is not built in as a continual, that's over in debt, but the 1.6 or 1.5 million,
Yes.
somewhere in that neighborhood that we're spending, so the additional mowing, things like that, that's anticipated that we're gonna keep doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, sir.
So, and that brings up, we're kind of mixing debt and cash here. We've got numbers, do I understand correctly? We've got numbers up on this screen that are borrowing numbers, but that's not our cost, our annual cost of that debt. So we're kind of mixing, $2.6 million, that's an annual, or 1.6 of that is an annual cash cost, city general fund for SOAR. But $1 million of that
Yes.
was borrowed, and while we in fact incurred $1 million worth of debt, we aren't paying $1 million in budget year 2018.
So the purpose of this slide is just to remind you of the things that you approved in general as a policy direction, just so that, because it's been 6 or 7 months since we adopted the budget. It's just a reminder.
I absolutely get that, but
Yeah, that's all.
I want us to not think about some of these numbers are borrowing numbers, and it doesn't represent our annual debt service on that.
Yes.
I agree with that, though it does in the sense that we go through and put all these capital projects in the list, and they represent a big number, but all those projects, when we put them in, I can't get to more than $15 million in annual debt service that's coming out.
And there you go. So I'd like to see them side by side. What are we borrowing and what's it going to cost us on an annual basis? That really would help me frame how much we have to have set aside to pay the bills every month, rather than this giant number that we're going to borrow. So, you say that
We can do that as part of the CMIP process, yes. Today, we're really only talking about the operating budget.
But I think we can frame it toward how much money we want to stay targeting annually for debt.
As you say,
That's
for
what we
example,
want to focus on
on
tonight.
debt, 15 million.
Yeah.
You don't want to borrow beyond that because you've established that borrowing beyond that has an annual cost.
It does.
It
Then you're going to, if you kept doing that,
Right.
then you're going to come over here in our debt service piece. We're going to say, well, you're going to have to put another mill in that. And as when you asked Kathleen the question that earlier in that, where we write on for where we were for debt service, yeah, we don't miss that because there's a number and says you owe $17 million.
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I'd love to be able to separate out what we're actually borrowing, but then the debt service on that borrowing, the annual cost to retire those debts.
Okay,
Okay.
we can do that.
Okay, budgetary initiatives. So this kind of jumps into the point where we were at. As we built our model, we looked at a couple of the big ones to say, city mill levy reduction. I think that's one that we built in there. The SOAR blight reduction program, if we want to add to that in any way or put more debt in. Street infrastructure, and that could be saying, let's spend an extra $1 million cash on street infrastructure. Yeah. Parks master plan, do we want to put some money in that? We put 0 toward the Parks Master Plan so far. We did that, studied it, said, boy, there's a lot of good initiatives in there. We put a little bit of money toward operations, but we didn't go after this $60 million program. Capital funding pay-go, debt reduction. So here's one to say, okay, we've got so much money programmed every year to spend, we could do this one of two ways. Say, instead of doing $15 million worth of debt, let's only do 14. But we still want to do all the projects. So it's not additional money toward infrastructure, it's taking some out of debt and putting it there, or an alternative would be to go after our temp notes We have 65 million in temp notes. We can fund those down now. As Kathleen went through the debt, you could come to those and say, let's pay off a couple million, and then we don't roll those into. Not real flashy because you've already spent the money, or we're spending it right now, but it takes it away from future debt service. And department special initiatives, here I just put this out as, I don't know what all those are yet, but do we allow for that? You know, this could be something to come forward, say we wanted to add 7 or 8 new police officers. Well, that's, you know, that adds up to $500,000, or yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood. If we get up to 15, you're at $1 million. So that equates to a mill rate when you start looking at things like that. Or, you know, you've had some departments like the DA, I think, talked to all of you about some initiatives he's working on. If I'm going to do 250, 500,000 worth of initiatives, I got to have some money to go after that. So I'm not going after $50,000, $100,000 items. I'm talking about things that really impact some of these other trends. The pilot. So if we want to do reductions on that, that's right. There's one to go after. Economic Development Gap Fund. That's one that's been discussed several times in the Economic Development and Finance Standing Committee. If we want to put money into that program, this is a time to identify that as an initiative. Increase our general fund reserves to the 3 months. So we're going to build this as a baseline, but you're going to see that Kathleen's programmed it in. We stay at the 17%. If you want to build it and get it up there, well, you can do nothing, or you can put some money toward it every year to move toward it. And then water pollution loan repayment. Most of us recall that we borrowed a lot of money from that fund back in 2010-11. We've been slowly paying it back, and we've got some more detail on that. In fact, I'm going to reference right now, and I think this is a really good guide for you. It's one of the handouts you receive. It says the Budget Initiative Information Packet. And when you go into your sessions, you may want to reference different sections on here. Like if you go to the second page in there where it's under the property tax, you see where it says general fund revenue per mill. So if you're doing a city mill rate reduction, it says $1,075,000, so that's generally $1.1 million. If you do it on the county side, it's $1.2 million. There's some comparison data on here that talks about the mill rates with other cities and county, what the county levies are, to show with all the different taxing jurisdictions. That's not as much for a workshop, it's just information of comparables. The SOAR initiatives are all listed here. Commissioner Markley, you mentioned those, so you can see here's the one-time items we built in, but on all the ongoing items are ones we're continuing to fund year to year. So if we want to throw some of those other things back in, this is where we would do it. We also listed the STAR initiatives and what's still on that in that group. Turn my page the right way. Page 10, I referenced the Parks Master Plan. It's listed as unfunded. I do note that we spent $550,000 was added for Parks operations, and that was really to catch us up from what we were trying to spend out there. And then we put $200,000 into some rehab that's like paying for a restroom or something, you know, a few things like that. But generally what you have is that plan said that we need to put $4.3 million into operations and $64.5 into capital. We have no money in that program right now going for that. Next page on that is the capital pay-go or debt reduction. I think this just demonstrates a little bit our target that's been for a number of years was to keep that in the 12 to 15. We've always pushed it right up there toward the 15 mark. So in 2016, we issued 14.8 million, 14.3, and then in 2018, we went to 16.2. And part of that push on that was in relation to the Leavenworth Road project and the ultimate deal we struck with BPU. And we decided we'd take some of the increased revenues we were getting in projection that was coming off of their rate increase and said, we'll use that to pay for this, and then it covered that cost. So I think that was part of the discussion as we went through that. Since we're getting the money back through the pilot, we'd use it to pay for that and not had the BPU pay for that piece of it.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, yeah, and that second point, just to clarify, you know, we do have a number of general obligation bonds outstanding, but the bond documents restrict us from actually, you know, just paying them off. And we can't pay them off until they reach their redemption date, which is, we noticed the next one that we could pay off would be in 2021. So if we want to reduce debt, the best way to do it is either borrow less in the future or pay off our temp notes before we roll them into a permanent financing. So.
If we ask the public to renew the public safety and infrastructure sales tax, what year would that be on a ballot?
It could be on the ballot later this year or for the first part of next year. What you want to do is have it done before we go through the budget process in 2019, because it ends in 2020. So if we lose $12 million from our budget, that would be a drastic change to any of the discussion we're having right now, and then we're not even really factoring for that. We're working toward the assumption, and unfortunately the survey said that's just a renewal of something that's been, I think, fairly positive on the impact on the community, that would stay in play. If we lose that $12 million, that'd be $6 million. It'll fall off halfway through 2020. We'd drop $6 million in 20 and $12 million from years going forward. So that'll be a different kind of retreat next year if we don't have that renewal in place. We'll be talking about where we're cutting.
I have a question for Doug and Kathleen. When we talk about the fund balance reserve, and I'm kind of bumbling my way through this, I'm trying to get to a point of understanding, and its effect on our cost of borrowing. I think you said for 20 million, it's a savings of 360-something thousand roughly. How, is there a systematic way to equate that to what that would mean relative to a reduction in the mill levy net present value? In other words, if I'm thinking about if we keep more in the bank, so to speak, if we keep our fund balance and we go to 25%, and that saves us 360-something thousand per 20 million. How do I look at that relative to, okay, well, we can then, or how does that direct the logic relative to the lowering or the stagnation of a mill levy in the net present?
Yeah.
I got it. I'll take Kathleen's numbers. After 3 to 4 years of continuing debt cycle of $15 to $20 million, you would be able to correlate that to a 1 mil reduction. After you did that about 4 years, because you're saving $365,000 a year, she said 20. On 20 million, we're trying to stay at 15, so I'll use it somewhere in the 3.5 to 4 year range. That's going to save you cumulative $1 million a year. $1 million is a mill.
Yeah.
So if you did that, achieve that, is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at my slide here. I was kind of talking off the top of my head before. I said 350,000. It's actually 312,000. So
4 years.
But yeah. So and as you know, we have 16 plus mills dedicated over in our city bonded interest fund over there. So basically, if we didn't issue as much, then, or we got a better interest rate, right, a lower interest rate, and our interest costs were down, then we could reduce that mill, you know. But a mill's a mill regardless of, you know, for the taxpayer, wherever it's funded at. So.
It helps me a little bit.
Yeah, but it equates to a third of a mill.
Okay, the next page in the group was about the franchise tax. So that shows the BPU electric, water, and then the UG sewer. So we have 11.9% franchise tax on the BPU, and we have a 12.9% franchise tax on our service. If you were to cut 1% off of those three areas, or two, however you look at it, that's about $4.6 million annually. So that's one area you can go after and look at what the target would be to make that change. It is important to note that we probably keep these close, just as far as, I mean, between what we're doing on the sewer and what we're doing with the BPU, because that issue comes up as we have discussions with the EPA. And then the last page hits the last two pages, we have the increase in reserves. That Kathleen's already talked about that quite a bit, of going to 3 months worth of reserves versus 2 months, and shows the dollar figures that can make that happen. And then the last page talks about our water pollution control loan. I think she did a good job of breaking that out on the last 2 bullet points on that page, where you look at it and say, we're structuring to go after $300,000 a year. That's what we built in. That takes 7 more years to pay that loan back. If we increase it to $500,000, we'd pay it back in 4 years. We can obviously pay it back all at once if we wanted to make it a major initiative. Yes?
We just passed approval to do some franchise tax on some additional folks, right? You know, charging people that wanted to use our
Right away.
yes, thank you.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, are we even thinking about what that could possibly bring in? None of that's figured in yet because we have no idea, right?
I heard it was around 25,000 a year.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not big.
It's not a big amount. That's why I'm asking, but I just wanted to mention, but 25,000 is 25,000. It fills a few potholes, okay?
Matter of equity of where you charge different people, but yeah, on the overall budget, it's not one that
Well, that's why,
really influences a lot today.
thank you.
All right, so that sets the stage for us, and we can have more questions when I think now, Mayor, if it works, I think it's a good time to take our break, and we'll come back, we'll set the exercise out so you have all the initiatives, and we'll be able to run through how the game will work, and then the game. Kind of work that way. Yeah.
Reggie's
We plug it in and go from there?
Reggie's gonna talk about the rules of the game
Yeah.
when we get back.
So with that, Mayor?
Thank you. Let's have dinner.
it might have been winter. Might have been winter, you know.
That was 16, I thought it was at least 17, oh my goodness.
All right, I'm gonna grab something here.
That was such a neat picture, I don't even know how it's on Facebook, but they don't share some emails last. And us with the Facebook, I said, it's a neat picture.
Oh, yeah,
Was
my
that
uncle's
taken
coming
here?
in. Yeah, my uncle John came up from Oklahoma. So, yeah. Kind of rare.
All right, let's reconvene.
All right, I will recognize Reginald Lindsay, our budget director, who's going to walk us through the exercise that we have set up. So unless there's any questions as we went through and laid out the initiatives, where they're at, you have your information booklet with you. So the next part, we're going to just walk through how all of you but two have done this before, so you know how it works, but we'll show kind of any of the tweaks we've done to it and how those work, and then take it from there. So took the remote away from me and left it on the other side of the room, Reggie.
So our exercise includes going into our unicast model. We're going to break out into 3 small groups. Those small groups are going to be facilitated by Emmerich, Gordon, and Joe. We're going to have one group right here, and then we're going to have one group in the breakout conference room here, and then we're going to have a group go down to the budget office. The unicast model consists of the financials that Kathleen just went through, and also the initiatives that Doug went through. So what we'll do is build a 5-year plan, and you'll get to like put numbers to the initiatives that we've seen, and also add initiatives that you feel might be deemed for this project. I don't know how you want to break us out, Doug.
You're not going to walk through it any?
I can walk through it.
Commissioner, do you have a question?
Go back to your previous slide. And again, this is what I've been saying for a long time now. Take item number 3, street infrastructure. To build an annual projection model, we need to use the amount that we're going to pay in cash. So this is, if you're thinking about borrowing to do street infrastructure, you got to work backwards to the annual cash outlay for the principal and the interest. So I want to make sure that we think in terms of annual cash here.
Yes.
So it goes back to what I said before, is we can't mix debt and cash, even conceptually, or we don't come up with any valid projections. We got to think in terms of annual cash necessary to pay off any borrowing, or annual cash necessary to pay for any service we want to buy.
Yes. And so that is right for that standpoint. If you want to say, if you think in broad terms of you have so much out there that's in debt now, or we go toward 15 million, and there's a combination of things that go into it, but you say, well, we want to add another million to that, but we'll do it in cash, to knock that off. That's what it is. And unfortunately, $1 million doesn't buy you a whole lot of street infrastructure. That's why we end up debting a lot of things, but that's how that's intended. Okay, so we will use the simple method I guess I've used before. Maybe I'll mix it up next year if you start moving your seats, but I'll give you a 1, 2, and 3 and ask you to go to that group. So Commissioner Johnson, you'll be a 1, Commissioner McKernan 2, Commissioner Bynum 3, Philbrook, you'll be a 1. We'll go 2 for Commissioner Burrows. Mayor, you'll be a 3. We'll go 1, 2, 3. Commissioner Townsend, you're a 1, and Commissioner Kane, you're a 2. So that'll give us, I want to do let's put group 1 down in the budget office down the hall.
Wait a minute. Are you 2? Yeah. It's you, me, her, and Tom. It's going to be a fun group.
We'll put the 2s.
Can I protest it?
Yes, you can go ahead and file that. We'll address it tomorrow.
Thank you, Doug.
And I think there'll be a reciprocal protest, so.
What?
Are we each getting a buddy like last year?
Yeah,
Like
I
Reggie
think so.
was in there with one of us.
Yeah, we're going to have,
Set up where there'll be a person from the budget staff and then also a person from the county administrator.
yeah, we'll have one of my assistants here and a budget person will be with you. And Kathleen and I will be roaming around, so if there's a question that comes up that can't be addressed by the 2 staff members working with you, then we'll figure out what the answer is or make something up.
Commissioner Bynum has a question.
I have a question before we break up into our groups. On the budget initiatives key information slides on page 5, where it breaks down our mill levies for all the taxing districts and all the cities and school districts, on the 3rd line, KCK, USD 500. To the far right is the column drainage district at 16 mils. But not everybody in KCK pays that, do they? Only if you live in a drainage district or have your business?
That's correct.
So that wouldn't be everybody
That is correct. That is not everybody. That is just those that are part of
in
the,
a drainage district. So that total levy at the far end column of that is actually lower for most people in KCK.
yes.
Okay.
I put this together, I was trying to, piece it together. I realized some of the jurisdictions don't necessarily overlap 100%.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure I was correct. Thank you.
Okay, and so 2 will be down the hall in the break room, and we'll do 3 will be right here at this table in this room. And we will go, for the facilitators, we're at 45 minutes from now. We're ahead of time, so if we need more time, we can work with that, but we'll anticipate being ready to break out in 45 minutes.
Yeah, north, south, east, west terms. I really get that.
Going east.
Can we start with my 2?
I forgot to bring a deck of cards.
Here are the initiatives.
All right, we're ready to go. Welcome back from the fun budget policy group exercise.
Hope everybody had fun. Okay, so what we're going to try to do now is build consensus from how easily it was for the 3 or 4 of you to build consensus, to build consensus among the 11 of you, at least to get some direction going from this point. So if we can break this out to each group and let you do your reporting. So who had group 1? Who's going to report for group 1?
Me.
Commissioner Johnson? And if you guys, yeah, I think you've got, do we have this to put up? We don't have to put up, do we? Maybe we need another minute before we start.
Right.
So just relax.
Okay.
You can work on your presentation a little bit longer.
Right, right.
What would really be nice is if he had it live on the screen.
Yeah, that's what I think they're trying to do.
Is that it?
Okay. So,
Are we ready?
yeah, so let's put some in this here. Well, I would put. I say we put.
All right, Commissioner Johnson, I think we have your group on the board.
All righty, let's go. Clap if you're ready. All right. So with the city mill and levy reduction, we went with a 1 mil reduction for the first 3, did we do 3 years? 3 years. Yeah, so we did it 2019, 2020, and 2021. Without a real.
You mean a mil per year?
1 mil per year, 1 mil per year. Okay. We invested $500,000 first year for SOAR, $300,000 and $200,000 for the subsequent years in 2021, 22, and 23. Those will be cash. That would come out of cash, not cash and or debt.
Whatever works.
But with the preference from cash. Over and above what we're spending. Streets and neighborhoods, the same philosophy with that as well. But we're open to alternative programs for that. So we're at $500,000 for the first, for 2019 and 2020. And then $250,000 for the subsequent years. Parks, $250,000 straight across. And the thought process with that, and you all help me with that, is if it's for, this can be looked at a couple of different ways. If it's for restroom improvements, I think, then we would just pay for that out of cash. We would, if it was gonna, for a larger overall program for all of the parks, say for $20 million bond deal, then that could be our debt reduction. So we would look at it both ways. It could be either or. We talked about the capital funding to do a one-time payment of $500,000 because we know that it reduces some number of time relative to our debt obligations. Don't know exactly how long that is, but we know it does reduce some period of time in terms of our debt obligation. And then we said we would put a $1 million investment in economic development. And if you look at how that impacts the overall, even by the end of 2021, we are still $1.2 million above the threshold of 17%, which, in my opinion, then helps to improve our overall rating, thereby reducing our cost of funds when we borrow for our borrowings going forward.
Anybody else on that committee want to comment?
Please, yes, help clean that up.
And I'll just say, when I look up there and see it, I see it's a comment toward a balanced attack toward the mill rate, putting more emphasis toward our blight reduction and infrastructure, which were top on our list, funding a plan we put in place, at least to some degree. What you've done is you've set up a budget that is, according to the current projections, in the out years, our expenditures will outpace the revenues, but that's something in that third mill rate reduction in 2021 you could evaluate at that point if you didn't do it, or you wouldn't have to keep spending all these other things because you haven't committed yourself beyond what you can afford. So well, that's logical. That could be implemented and can work. That's
we referred to the citizen survey, so that was what kind of drove us from the top level piece, particularly with SOAR and street and neighborhood infrastructure. So,
any questions from the other group?
Yeah, I have a question on the SOAR piece. Oh boy, my eyes are bad. 500,000 the first year, 300 is that the second year, and then 200, 200, 200.
500, 300, and then they're doing 200 each year going forward.
And so right now we
over and above what we currently spend.
Over and above. Thank you. Gotcha.
We know there's a threshold there somewhere where we feel like we'll have funded SOAR, and it's going to kind of take on its own life. So we know we feel at some point we're going to probably back off of that because that threshold.
As it reduce the number of houses actually that are, then that burden won't be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Logan, you guys been able to capture all that over there on the flip charts? Okay. All right, any other comments on this one? All right, why don't we pull up group 2, right?
And we improve our bond rating.
There you go. And you've got to take the 650 in 2023 out of street neighborhood infrastructure. It's going to have to come out. Yeah, that last one. Don't turn it off, just take the 650 out of 2023.
No, only out of 2020.
Only out of zero that. Now scroll back up, we should actually be over our, yep, we're right there.
There you go. Zero. Brilliant.
So, that's okay. So we actually spent our time having a lot of very good substantive rationale discussions about how we approach this. And we came up with, basically we've got four prerogatives that we think the citizens want. One, property tax reduction. And then, again, to go back to my BIC analogy, blight removal, infrastructure improvements, and communications, which are the three things that are the highest priority, that have the lowest satisfaction out of the items, at least on the city part of our survey. So what we did was we took a 2 mil reduction in property taxes for fiscal year 2019. We let that ride for 1 year, and then we added another 2 mils in 2021. A total of 4 mils of reduction over the 6 years of this time. We assume that SOAR will be funded at its current level of 1.7. It will continue to be funded. We're not going to cap that. We're going to depend on that to continue with the progress that we've already started. And kind of back to what Angela said a moment ago, we start to reach the point of accelerating returns with SOAR as the number of problems are chipped away. At least that's the thought. Neighborhood and street infrastructure, this was really hard for us because we wanted to just borrow a whole bunch of money, but if we put $650 a year for 4 years into that, we can start to chip away at some of the sidewalks, whether they're not there or whether they need to be replaced. So it could be a cap onto either our cash or our debt financing for some public works improvements. And then, you've got, but we turned it off. So that $500,000 in the Economic Development Gap Fund is actually not there. You see that it's turned off. It is not factoring in. Parks Master Plan, we didn't put any funding toward that because, again, if you go back to the citizen survey, although it's high importance, the satisfaction's fairly high. So we decided not to put money toward that. We decided not to take anything out of pay-as-you-go effectively is our street and neighborhood infrastructure. We didn't borrow that. We're paying cash for it, but up there rather than some other. Department special initiatives, none. Pilot reduction, none. Gap fund, I'll get to that in a moment. Increase to 3 months of reserves to 3 months of expenditures. We thought 2 months was fine. The 17% was what we were shooting for. So now if you'll scroll up to where we can see the reserves, Commissioner Burrows had a really nice idea here since, no, we're fine. He knows where to go. He knows where to go. Go to 2019, please. And you know, he knows right where it is, right there. So if you see that there's $45 million worth of reserves right there, Tom said, well, why don't we consider taking a percentage of that? For example, take 1% of those reserves. Taking 1% doesn't drop us below our 2 months of reserves, our 17%, but it is a way that can fund, kind of variably even, some of that economic development. And our thought was, our trajectory eventually gets rid of, or takes us right down to the 2 months of reserves. But for those first 4 years of this plan, there's theoretically a lot of cash that could be available in a gap fund policy. And what we said was, we'll take 1%. So for that 1 year now, we've got $450,000 in 2019. There'd be $490,000. That can't be the right unrestricted fund balance.
Yeah, that assumes you're not spending this.
Yeah.
That would be the fund balance. Anyway, but what you're saying is 1% of this. That's actually what you're saying, 1% of that.
Now, it's 1% of whatever is over the 17% of annual expenses.
Oh, that's what all this is, right?
It's one.
That's the 20 million, you already spent that. Sure, or the balloon, it's the same thing.
But what we're saying is that if you take, you've got a decrementing, 1% gives you a decrementing amount of cash over the next 4 to 5 years that could be used to spur economic development, close gaps, but with cash and not with borrowing, which was always my concern about the gap fund policy as we brought it forward. We're going to borrow to grant. This gives us cash to grant. And the idea was we stimulate it in the first few years. So anyway.
Okay. Anybody else from that committee want to comment or clarify anything?
If you do want to dedicate 1% of the reserves, then what you're saying, then because you've already spent all of it, then what you're saying is that you want the reserve target to be 16%, not 17%.
Guess I don't know how to read this chart. Would be, see, once again, it would be nice if I could look at these things ahead of the meeting so I can wrap my brain around what numbers are where on this.
Okay.
There's a lot of numbers on this. What we decided was, in our first year, my understanding was that we had dollars in excess of what it would take to have 2 months of 17% of reserves.
That is correct.
And we would take 1% of the dollars in excess of whatever it took.
Go down.
Yeah, go back up there. Okay, so that is this $20 million right here. That is all the money available after the 17% reserve.
But isn't he saying he only wants 1% of the 5.8? That's the red bar after he spent all the other money. Is that what you're trying to say, Brian?
It was, but evidently I don't understand this,
He wants 1% of the 5.8 million that's above the 17% on the bar graph. Go down to the bar graph. 1% of that, and then 1% of the 5.7, and 1% of the 3.3, and 1% of the 1.4.
Thank you, Ed.
But you spend it the next year and the next, so.
That's what we said. We said every year, it is 1% of the red bar. So it's 1% of 5.8, it's 1% of 5.7, it's 1% of 3.3, it's 1% of 1.4, and then it's done.
Okay.
4 years of cash incentive to close gaps.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Well, there's no more money, yeah, so you need to get into the table below in order to account for it.
Okay, so I understand what you said, so let's just make sure we're accounting for that down below. So if you come down.
Just gonna put in my request again to get materials ahead of time so I can look at it.
Okay,
This is an interactive model, Commissioner, I
Yeah.
understand. So you wanna do that
My own interactive.
here
I know how to do these things.
on 20, you wanna turn this on at a certain number for each of those. So if you do that, it takes away some of that reserve each year. So I think that's the only point that has to be modified to it, is that we need to adjust it, and then your model it'll just eat up the rest of that money. It'll eat up a little faster, and that's all. Yeah, and and the good part about that too is, hopefully by doing that, you're also investing in something that brings revenue back in. Now, the revenue that returns probably is off this chart somewhere before we see it really start to come back in, but it is working to grow our community.
Well, and that's another thing that we discussed, but we didn't work in here, was we're gonna have assessed valuation increases, we're gonna have potentially all sorts of increases spurred by this, but we didn't want to count on any of those. We wanted to take the conservative estimates for moving forward. Conceptually, that's what we want. If I ever do get that spreadsheet in my email, I'll give you one that shows the exact numbers we talked about.
Okay, so do we want to turn this on to follow that 1%? I mean, I'm good with it. 1% of 5 million. It's 50,000. So,
I think the other thing to keep in mind also is that the way I interpreted this is that this is just the gap fund. So it has to be an economic development project that's coming in front of us that has a gap in it. And so there has to be an existing project. Otherwise, that money will never be spent. So you could go 2 or 3 years without ever spending any money at all.
yeah.
And this is only the gap fund for a project coming in front of us. This isn't for any special initiatives that the commission would want to do in the way of economic development.
And I know we're not going to get down into the details on that, but my only concern, again, on a gap fund that we say is only there for existing projects. Once you do one gap fund of an existing project that has a gap, the word's going to get out. I mean, everybody will expect then and they will find the gap. So that's my concern, that.
So Mayor, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I hope that happens, because right now, nothing's coming forward. Serving on Economic Development Standing Committee for the last 4 years, in particular, this targets the areas east of 635. At least people will take an interest and will get projects to the table. Right now, nothing on its own is coming forward in the way of economic development for the neighborhoods east of 635. So yes, I hear what you're saying, and there might be some concern, but I view it the opposite that you do. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's at least going to get people to pay a little bit of attention to us and to start bringing stuff forward. Right now, we've got nothing to look at.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify too. I mean, 1% of 5 million is 50,000. So just perspective of where we're working with. Okay. Commissioner?
This,
Agree on, so I can't speak to the spreadsheet either, but what we did all agree on is that if we were gonna do this fund, that an amount like $50,000 would not be enticing, and we'd be in the same position that we're in. So that's where we came up with at least $500,000, or it's not worth anybody's time, especially on a quality project. I mean, we might get,
Commissioner Burrows, did you have a comment?
What they're saying is that I misread the spreadsheet we've written there. I mean, there was only 50,000 to have. The 1% was only gonna generate 50,000, and if it's 50,000, then, you know, you just said, what's the point? And I agree. So, misread the spreadsheet, and we don't have that kind of money. We've still got our 4 mills of tax reduction. We've still got our infrastructure improvements. We may or may not have gap fund.
that's where our group of 4, we had a little different perspective. Everybody had their different opinion sort of on this, is that if we don't do anything, that's what we've been doing, and that's not working, because there really hasn't been any development in the urban core area, any significant amount of development, without another party going out and getting their own gap financing from somewhere else. So, I mean, that's, some people were in the group were very concerned, and my group members can jump in, we're very concerned about debt financing this line item. I was not as concerned about that, but others made good arguments for why they would be concerned about that. But others too. I mean, it wasn't just Brian. But I do think if we don't do anything, we're gonna just keep getting what we're doing, which is nothing.
Okay, so focus here. Obviously, you went after the mill rate, a little more aggressive than the other group. 1 more mill, and I mean, it still takes to 2021, and give yourself a little bit of room. If things went in a different direction, you could correct and take an emphasis toward the street and infrastructure as your #1 area to spend more money for the survey. Okay? How about group 3?
I'll kick off group 3. We had myself, Mayor Alvey, and Commissioner Walters, and we started from the starting point that the star bond payoff philosophy from the beginning had been mill levy reduction. Is this our chart? Okay. So our mill levy reduction is a 2 on the city side, 1 on the county side across the 5 years, which represents $3.4 million. We funded the Parks Master Plan at $500,000 annual, with the potential that that could be debt service on borrowing $15 million and upward to fully fund our Parks Master Plan. And then the line 6, the Department Special Initiatives, is actually a $7 million reduction in projected 2019 expenditures. And the conversation was that we should hold 2019 expenditures to our 2018 level. And I will also just add briefly that we had a brief conversation around the topic of when and if we renew our public infrastructure or public safety and infrastructure sales tax, that we dedicate a portion of that revenue directly to Parks Master Plan funding. It's not really represented here on the model, but we had that conversation. And then finally, I think that's my portion of it. Mayor, if you want to chime in, and then.
Actually, I'm going to defer to Mr. Walters.
We had a lot of involved conversations, probably more so than show up on this chart. But one of the things that concerns me is our growth in spending over the past several years that exceeds the cost of living. And so as an exercise, we suggested, well, what if we start, instead of figuring out how much money we're going to get and figuring out a way to spend it, what if we start at the other end and say, well, this is what we spent last year. Can we achieve the same things if we don't have an increase? And we may not be able to, obviously, but we can't solve all the problems in 45 minutes. But the only way to do that on this chart was to have a $7 million expenditure reduction in department special initiatives, which I guess $7 million evidently is the, according to this worksheet, the expected increase in expenditures. So it's 3.5% increase over 2018. I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I think we do need to think about stopping the trend of increasing our expenditures so far in excess of the cost of living increases. So that was the impetus for starting where we did. Now, if you go up to the top, we also had a long discussion about not increasing the reserves, but I think we actually did that. And I think if we had more time, we would have probably directed some of that reserve increase to debt reduction. But we just, oh, I can? Oh, all right, well, do that, please. Well, is that correct? Or we definitely had a conversation about priorities. Priority being investing money wisely where it makes tangible impact on property valuations, to cutting taxes to help grow our overall tax base, and then just the actual growth of the tax base through strategic investment. So those were our priorities, and then another priority of reducing debt to improve our overall balance sheet.
So it just, we felt that the promise of the trend was to continue to reduce the mill levy, and we thought it would be helpful to distribute that also as well to the residents, the citizens of Edwardsville and Bonner, at least to some extent. And so that's why we dedicated 1% reduction to that side of it. We also are concerned, or we're concerned that we've completed the Parks and Rec master plan, and we do these master plans and then don't follow it through, come right on with funding. What's the point of that? We've expended the money and created the vision and then said, well, that would be great, but now we're not going to bring funding to that. So we feel that's a concern. And again, the hope is that we have to be very cautious we have to look at all expenditures as an investment in our neighborhoods, and that we're really seeking to improve the quality of life for our residents. And as we do that, that will be reflected in property values. And as property values rise, that allows us then to distribute that tax burden on more people, on higher value, and so continue to reduce that. So it's a long-term play, but the property tax rate is an inverse proportion to property value, and the higher the property tax rate goes, that causes a decrease in property values. And so if you want to get that down, you got to reduce the property taxes and at the same time try to bring values up, to bring those into balance.
Turned it off, then I turned it on. On your $700,000, or $7 million rather, in the first year. So that just you've got a graph where you're increasing. You blunted that increase for 1 year, and then it continues to increase after that year, right?
Only
Because the model has increments built in for every year.
Right.
So you flattened it off for 1 year, but then it's gonna go up after that.
Yes.
So to truly flatten it down, you'd have to have an accelerating amount, right?
Right.
Yeah, I don't think we could hold expenditures level forever.
Exactly.
Right.
But, okay, so I see that's interesting.
Commissioner Kane?
They're significant.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, and we have done a lot of studies. We waste a lot of money. And the expectation of the people goes up there and then said, by God, we got this plan, but we have no funding to perform the plan. So that's why we left that one alone. And the reason we went after lowering the mill levy is that's what everybody wants us to do. And I love the way you did this year. This makes it easier, especially I hope for you, the new guys. But we're going to make his life miserable. It's somewhere in the middle of this. You got to gel it all together. And I hope we've given you enough guidance or misguidance today to get that done. But the people still want their taxes lowered down. We can have this great big plan, and when we did it across the board, then everybody feels it. And I think that's the most important thing we need to focus on.
Well, I'm new to this process, as you all know, and we're being prudent in addressing what the constituents have clearly stated they want, and that is a mill levy reduction to lower the property taxes. Unfortunate side of that is we come in prepared to do that with valuations going up simultaneously. So the hard part is how do we communicate that to our constituents so they understand that we took their concerns to heart and addressed it in this budget. Now, I do commend those that talked about the county and the city mill reduction. I would just ask this body, are we prohibited from sending a letter to the other taxing entities that raise the mill levy of our ratepayers to hold the line on their expenses?
No, you're not.
Are we prohibited from doing that?
Prohibited. You have no legislative authority to tell
Right.
them what to do, but you certainly can express your wishes upon them if you so desire.
Well, and I know how difficult that can be, and I know the challenges they face. But ultimately, we're all in this together. And if we erase the mill levy and lower it, only to have somebody else come in and take advantage of that, we're all painted with the same brush. We should be partners in this process. We're all community members and we're all community leaders. I would hope that we would give strong consideration to sending a strong message to those entities that levy a tax base, a mill, that to hold the line on their spending, at least through the first year, so the residents absolutely have a chance to be educated on the lowering of the mill and the increase in valuation, and that we continue to work as a partnership here to look how we can reduce the cost of taxation on our ratepayers.
Well, you know, I think as an individual, any of us could do that. You know, my only concern is, you know, look at Piper. So they knew that they had a very serious need for new facilities that they have been delaying for a long time and have not had success in passing a mill levy. And so now they were finally able to develop the commitment, the consensus in the community, even though it was a low voter turnout, to move that project forward, which is going to be a significant investment in the community, because investments in education really do result in increase in property values. So, you know, I think as you said, it's a very difficult thing, and we know the decisions they have to make, and they don't have the same control over revenues perhaps as we do, because we can, you know, in terms of sales tax and pilot, they don't have those same access to resources that the unified government has.
Mayor, just a comment to Commissioner Burrows. request of visiting with our other taxing entities. I want to put something forward that I've put forward to several of you individually, and I've put it forward to you, Mayor. And I think it might be a difficult task, but not an undoable task when we convene in a convocation every taxing entity, including the state, including the Board of Public Utilities, every school district, Bonner, Edwardsville, Turner, Piper, but the cities of Bonner and Edwardsville, and the college, into a session with us that's a facilitated conversation around seeing if we share priorities, and particularly priorities around budgeting and spending, because right at the moment, it is a fact that we are not watching other taxing entities lower their mill levy rates. We have not seen that occur, to my knowledge, in the last 3 or 4 years among other taxing entities. And if we're truly seeking real tax reduction, I would think that might be a priority for everybody. But what also might happen if we were to have that facilitated convocation of all taxing entities, we might identify 2 or 3 priority areas that all of those groups agree are priorities. And then we might find ourselves willing to work more collaboratively toward how can we do those things more efficiently. And so I just want to put that forward as just something worth thinking about that speaks directly to the point that you are making. Thank you.
So I think we want to get back to our budgeting retreat. Commissioner McKiernan.
Thank you, Reggie, for sending me the spreadsheet. Now that I fully understand how it's built, our idea still holds, except we go with 10% rather than 1%.
Right.
And it still holds, and you get $600,000 in 2020. You get $580,000 in 2020, then 570, then 330, then 140. It decrements just as we had imagined it would when we sat in the other room, now that I know what actual line of this thing to look at. So our model would still work as originally proposed, with a decrementing pool of gap funds to be there.
And that is a ceiling per year. And we as a body have the right to determine if the project warrants any gap funding. And if we have more than 1 or 2 projects, we can either decide if we want to fill the full gap, partial gap, and encourage them to find additional dollars and resources elsewhere. But it's not a mandatory gap. If you come up with a gap, you're not going to get all of that money. It will be determined on the project itself. And actually, we can leave that up to the administrator to do that, or we can look at it individually through the Economic Development Committee and make a recommendation back to the full commission. That's something we can hammer out later, but at least we're front-loading it. We have that money there. We know how much every year it's going to run us. And by the time the 4th or 5th year comes around, it should be paying for itself in new development and new revenue without borrowing the money.
So if there are not any other questions or comments, I think we're at the time. Mr. Bach, do you feel like you have the direction you need from the?
I probably feel a need to comment a little bit on this last sheet that's up here, because you guys have a rather aggressive reduction in expenses, and where's the pointer at? Who has it? So you've identified $7 million in reduced expenses, and I appreciate the challenge to say where we at for normal cost of living, but I just want to look at, here on this page, we're showing, and so you took this number to say 2018 to 2019. Is that kind of what you were looking at?
Correct.
They take 7 out of that, so we have about a $8 million increase, really, not really. That's about 7. 210 to 217, so it's about $7 million difference. Generally, if you look at my expenses that we built in this year, we got a little bit more in services. Some of those are fixed contracts that come into play. Right here, this is my $6 million number in personnel. that's labor contracts and capers. So if you give me that direction to cut 7 million, I'm either cutting out service contracts, supplies. I mean, I'm gonna cut 7 out of these categories, that's pretty severe, or I'm reducing something we're doing because I'm cutting a lot of bodies. So that's kind of a direction I kind of need to understand, especially when 55% of our budget's in public safety.
And so can I ask a question to that, because that's helping me? You know, what we were looking at was the increase in expenditures kind of year over year. So from 2015 to 2018, it's about 20 million. In total expenditures and transfers, the increase is about 20 million. And so is that, based on what you're saying, would that be primarily in people and personnel?
Well, take that back down. No, back up. I'm sorry, I'm telling you the wrong direction. Yeah, I mean, when you look at personnel, here's 16,143 and 19,158.
Mostly people.
So that's the biggest portion of the increase in operating that I have.
Okay. Well,
and that's driven by, and you know, we haven't been our COLAs have been 2%, just finally doing a little 3%, you know, and before, the years before, we were at 0 for
I will just say, for my part, that helps me feel better about seeing that level of increase year over year in expenditure, because that's giving people raises, if I'm understanding you correctly about the items that are in the personnel line item, that's paying into retirement funds.
Which are fixed, they're given to us by the state of Kansas, so we don't really have, you know, we can't state what those are, and we still have our buyout. So I mean, I just want to bring that into perspective. If that's a direction we go, I would need a lot more guidance, because I would need to stop doing something that we're doing, would be the only way to go about that. And we just, and only one group brought that up, so it kind of narrows it down that where it becomes, we got to figure out where we'd go in that direction.
Commissioner Kane, did you have?
I'm not for eliminating anybody's job, and in fact, we have several openings, correct?
Yes, we always do.
Oh, that's not, but we don't have enough employees to perform the job function we want to perform. So I would be wholeheartedly and red-faced and really pissy if we laid anybody off.
I think the point we were trying to evaluate, and understand we can't solve all the problems in 45 minutes, but we came up with a number in this exercise that was about a 3.5% increase in expenditures from, I think, from 17 to 18, whatever 7 million of 202 is. And I guess we were just trying to challenge that to say, where did that number come from? Is it the real number? A lot of these numbers, we don't know, like capital outlay goes from 3.3 in the first column to 6.5 in the current year. I don't know how to explain what's in that number. But it looks like it's had, you know, some rigor put to it. I just want to challenge, do we really need to increase our expenditures as much as we are shown on this chart?
Yeah, and if I can hit capital outlay, just mention the 3.3 was severely underfunded, and from the days when we were trying to we cut our capital to the point, and we weren't buying hardly anything new, and that put us in a bad way.
I think that was the other part of the discussion, was that a lot of the increases in rate increases over the years, part of that was due to the fact that after the economic emergency, expenses were reduced, and a lot of this was catch-up, especially perhaps on expenditures for equipment and so forth. Commissioner McKiernan?
So, Doug, it sounds to me like you want hard budget direction out of this exercise. And I will tell you, I think that is foolish for us to try to do this. This is a great exercise. It's a good mental exercise. But to come back and to take 3 separate groups who have 3 separate approaches and try to meld that all in a 20-minute discussion and come up with hard direction for you, I think you've seen that there's a lot of different ways to skin this cow, but I would be, Cat, thank you.
Now the question is why.
But I'll just speak for myself. I think that for us to say this is hard budget direction, it's a little dangerous, and I'm just on the record.
Yeah, I guess and I don't know, maybe our group took it a little bit differently. It seemed to me that what we were trying to do is, let's dig down to what are the priorities here. And what really is coming clear to me is mill reduction. And there is some commitment to, as your group said, you know, streets, parks, capital improvements, and our group was parks and rec. Those investments that are going to really make a difference in improving the quality of life for citizens. We kind of know what they are. We know we don't have enough money, but we know we want to do mill reduction. To what level? That still has to be worked out. We know we need to put money into infrastructure and improvements to neighborhoods. Okay, where and how? We know we're committed to that. So if that's the direction, if that's sufficient direction, we're done.
I would agree. I mean, I really do feel like that. Across the board, every group came back saying mill reduction. That still needs to come into play. And pushing toward getting a couple in there this year seems to be the emphasis between 1 and 2, but that there's the ability to keep that steady decline going with it. Streets was still a continual theme, that at least 2 of the groups that put those up. Some emphasis towards SOAR, you know, that I think only 1 group identified it as an out-year thing. 2 out of the 3 came back with emphasis toward funding up the Parks Master Plan. And then a couple of you identified some money toward the GAP fund. So if I take and look at all the categories that were out there that we've discussed over the last year or time, you know, here comes, and obviously you spend a fair amount of time in the one group talking about ways we can be efficient, you know, and maybe that number's not 7 million, but it's some number. It's trying to continue to be efficient with where we're going. So that does help us a lot, because if I'm scattering over 10 or 12 categories and trying to put $500,000 or $1 million into all those, that's a little harder to do. It didn't leave a lot of room probably for department initiatives. That's probably one thing that kind of holds the line, that is kind of like, if we're not doing it now, I didn't get probably a lot of latitude back for me to come and say, here's something we want to add to the budget.
I think the other message that I heard was that there was not a commitment necessarily to really get into that 3-month reserve fund. I think that was clear.
I would agree.
Mayor?
I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Murgia. I just have a suggestion or a comment to make. So it's great for all of us to get together and give you our opinion about what the priorities are, and I know the commission has changed since we had this discussion initially, but I thought when we started this survey, the community survey process with ETC, we were spending money on that and outsourcing it so that the community could drive what our priorities were here at the government. So that's my first comment. I'm just sort of throwing it out there. Then my second sort of comment suggestion, I guess, and I tried to explain this in my group, and I'm not sure I did a good job, so I'm going to try again. What's great about Wyandotte County is that all of our commission districts are different. And I would bet, and I think we did do this or have paid to have this done, is that we break the survey data down by district. And that then staff meets with the commissioners of that district with the survey and the priorities of the community to determine how funding is allocated in that district. And the reason I think this could be an effective way to keep our costs down, to be more efficient, to have maintain those incremental improvements for a better reserve fund, is that, and I don't know anything else to do other than give you an example. So some districts, the emphasis may be on sidewalks. Some districts, the emphasis might be on a grocery store, or some districts, the emphasis might be on drainage. Instead of, and I don't know if you've done this in the past, but instead of trying to make sure that each district gets 1/10 of every budget line item, when it may not necessarily be a priority in their district, in order to create some impact and to develop some momentum, in order to make some significant visible change and improve the quality of life in people's specific neighborhoods, I think it'd be easier if we looked at those in-district surveys and we moved the greatest amount of money to the highest priority areas in those districts. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, and so I don't know that we already do that, but I don't want to give anything away out of my district, but I am going to give a physical example. So if there's $1 million in curb and sidewalk, and that isn't one of my top 3 items, but it's Commissioner Townsend and Commissioner Kane's one of their top 3 items, then as I can only speak for myself, I have no issue with the bulk of that funding going to them, where you would, the bulk of the funding that would come to my district would be one of my top 3 items. I just think when we, you know, if I get it, then Commissioner Walters gets it. If we have that mindset, there's never any momentum developed. There's never any real difference that takes place. We have to learn as commissioners in our district to prioritize what's important for that area, fund it well, make a difference, have something that we can point to and show people this is significantly different now, it's significantly better, and then work on the next item in the following year. So I don't know if that helps you at all, and that's just my opinion, but I really think that'd make a substantial difference.
Commissioner McKiernan.
Well, I agree. We've given you some great direction, things we'd like to see happen, but I'll pick on, in particular, department initiatives. You just mentioned that. What were they? I mean, there's nothing in this PDF document. That's the one line item that actually doesn't have any flesh to it. We didn't hear any pitch from any department that if we had this, we could make magic happen. So that's why I say that sometimes this is a really hard exercise, because it is mostly theoretical, or in large part theoretical. I think you're right. In terms of mill rate reduction, in terms of infrastructure improvement, I think you're hearing clear from all of the groups that those are things we want. But to get down and say, well, I don't really, you know, you guys didn't say fund any department initiatives. Well, I didn't know what they were. And so, anyway, thank you.
Commissioner Bynum?
I think there are department initiatives that we may have on our wish list. So if we want to, at some point, get into those, or maybe once we get into budget workshop time, when we begin hearing from departments, we may chime in with items that are on our wish list, so to speak. I think another thing that's going to happen is, as we move closer and closer to a product with our Northeast Master Planning effort, there are going to be some real things that we're going to be wanting to ask to spend money on, and we aren't going to know that for 3 or 4 more months maybe. But so we can't really speak to that today in this exercise, but I think we can all agree that once that plan is closer and closer to a product that's adopted by this commission, there's going to be dollar amounts that we're going to be asking be allocated for that plan, just as an example.
Commissioner Burrows?
Thank you. Doug, my position on not building the 3 months reserves, I think that's it's a very prudent thing to do for us to get there, but I also think if we can reduce some of the debt, I think we heard from some of the other commissioners that if we can reduce some debt, we will get to the end, we will be able to build our reserves quicker in the long run. But that's that balance there. But you know, in going through this exercise, what I see from it, one, is that the commissioners are committed to lowering the tax burden on the citizens of our community. Our employees are getting a pay raise. Services are doing well. We've seen in the last 2 weeks that the services and the programs that your administration and the commissioners before before this year put into place are working, and it's making a difference in the community. To back off of that would be foolish for financial reason. We are making strides, and it takes a little at a time. But the only way we're going to do this is to control some of this spending. But I'm one that I want to find that balance where we have enough in reserves to meet our 2-month criteria. And I think it's a novel approach to put away the 3 months. I commend you to have those rainy day funds. But we're also coming out of a time when we drain those rainy day funds. And at the same time, we implemented programs, and we have that momentum, and we should keep it going. But I really think that our employees should be cognizant of the fact that they're getting a pay raise, and I'd like to have it be more. But maybe if we continue on being fiscally responsible in how we approach this budget and not spend all the money that we see coming in, but be responsible in paying down some of that debt and slowly move into these programs. I'd like to be able to cut the mills even deeper, and I hope that in 2 years we have this discussion again to cut it another 3 or 4.
I appreciate that, and I think, and one of the things Ms. Von Atchen has pointed out, that every year when we go through this, you know, we budget and we come in fairly close on the revenue. Sometimes we have some things that pop in one way or another, but our expenses, we always expend less than what we budget, and that's where we have to be, because I can never expend more, and that allows some room for money to fall to the bottom line. And that's kind of one thing when we're doing an exercise like this. It doesn't really afford that opportunity to say, well, there's going to be some money left every year. And I think Kathleen has really also pushed, you know, you're at 17%, and if you kind of just don't spend what you don't use in any government each year, then you slowly go toward that 25%. And we may not get there in 5 years, but we did by making great strides, really by doing that, by not spending what we didn't do and had some bigger chunks of money fall to the bottom line. And that got us back at 17, where we were down at, 8% not very long ago.
Commissioner Markley.
Yeah, I was just going to point out, most of you were here, but some of you weren't. Remember when we were desperately trying to get to 10%? Remember that? Desperately trying to get to 10%. So we should pat ourselves in the back a little bit, because that was not very many years ago. I haven't been here that long, that we thought we would never get to 10%, and now we're talking about how do we keep it at 17. So we did better than we thought we could. Good job.
Okay, Mr. Bach, can we talk about next steps and the calendar?
Certainly. Oh, I guess we need to switch sheets. And as far as next steps, I mean, the next big items that come before us are when we start to move into CMIP. So from a staff perspective right now, Mr. Lindsay just issued out to the organization today to have all departments start turning in their capital projects. So we start going through those. They get them in the month of March. My office spent some time reviewing them in April, so we can come back in May. Sorry. Can you move that calendar? I'll put this down. So we're there in CMIP process in May. I think we've got a couple of meetings already on your calendars. They should be on there. And then we'll develop from there to try to get that in play, to try to work within that debt ratio that we were working with, and then how much money we're looking at as projected for cash based on our projections. We'll build the budget, and really as we move through June, that's kind of that opportunity. We'll have some of those special initiatives that can't define today, but get some feedback from commissioners, whether there's some things there that we want to do or try to build in and go through those, and probably some on-threes with you all, get some feedback toward the end of June, and then present the budget in July, and we will go into workshop stage. But as it's been the last couple of years, I really hope that the budget that I can present to you in July is one that has a lot of input. This isn't the last conversation I will have with you. We won't sit down in this kind of format as much, but I'll work from this and then try to just get more one-on-one or group, feedback as we go through, so different things we're working on. So when I do present a budget on July 12th, I'm hoping that it'll be in line with what you all are thinking. And And then what we do through the workshops is hopefully more just tweak some of the stuff and move on it from there. And that's all we have, Mayor.
Thank you. I want to thank all of staff and obviously the commissioners. Great work tonight, and I think we made great progress. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, staff.